Hey, Jody, thanks for joining me today. I'm excited to talk a little bit about e-invoicing and how things have changed over the course of time and the impact it's had not only for our clients, but for companies like Revenew, where we're always taking a look at how we can help companies with their business improvement opportunities.
Yeah, let's dive into it.
Right on. We have in the past talked a lot about, like what makes the ideal audit from our perspective, right? Can you articulate a little bit about what we look for, like when we're evaluating an opportunity with a prospect and somebody who's thinking about revenue? What are some of the things that we look for that we know that'll be a successful project for both them and for revenue?
I really think that any company can benefit from doing a recovery audit that's focused on their procure to pay process. But some of the factors that I think contribute to a higher need to do an audit is certain situations that may have recently occurred, such as the implementation of a new ERP system or a large acquisition of another company, and those 2 companies are now trying to integrate their procure to pay process, or something such as the outsourcing of the accounts payable function to a third party. In almost every situation where we've done an audit following one of those events, we almost always have found a spike in the normal error rate that we would see with a client that didn't have one of those events. So, if a company has recently had one of those situations, I think they should definitely be looking to do an audit to A, recover the funds that have been lost from that spike in errors that undoubtedly did occur, but also take the learnings from those findings to fine tune these new processes that they have in place, whether it's a new ERP system or you're now outsourcing that function to a third party. This will be an opportunity to learn from the errors that have occurred to put additional controls in place so that those don't happen again in the future.
So we've obviously done a ton of projects where that's the case, right? So you've got, mergers, acquisitions, you got outsourcing, maybe a flip over to a new ERP system, or you're implementing the latest and greatest of the current one that you have. Do you have an example of how we've helped a client sort of accelerate that curve a little bit as a result of the project? Because I know like a lot of the times these companies would be really hesitant to add another project on top of this already busy workload that they have. So
Mm.
how do we help them accelerate to get to the end result where it's like, hey, ERP is working great again?
We did have a large, multi-billion dollar customer in the oil and gas industry that had a few of those scenarios happen at once. They implemented an upgrade to their ERP system, which essentially was like putting in place a brand new system. And at the same time, they outsourced their accounts payable function to a third party. So it was almost a double whammy of events that came together at the same time. And it resulted in a dramatic spike in the level of errors that were occurring. And this was a client that we had previously done projects with on a periodic basis. We would come in, we would do an audit over the last 3-year time period, and then we would take a break and come back and repeat that project again in 2 years. But once we saw how the error rate had dramatically risen in such a short period of time, we recommended moving them to what we call a continuous project where we never stop auditing. It's just more of an ongoing program. And the main benefit of that to the customer was that they were getting a real time feedback loop of the issues that were occurring, and they could then address that immediately so that those issues didn't persist for an extended period of time. So If it was an issue with the third party, we could identify the actual individual at that third party that was responsible for these errors and target that individual for additional training. If it was something specific to the ERP system, again, we may identify a process that needed some additional training across the entire user base, or maybe we identified one particular individual that wasn't using the system in the correct way, and we could then target that individual for additional training. But the overall benefit was just this continuous, nonstop feedback loop of issues that were being identified
Mhm.
so that we could immediately go into fix mode
Yeah.
rather than we're going to wait another 2 years to do an audit project and then try to address these issues. Because by that point in time, things would have spiraled so far out of control, it'd have been difficult to pull things back at that point.
It's interesting to me that in that answer, there's equal parts about systems and processes and people, right? I think that's often overlooked, right? It's like, you get a new person in and they haven't been fully trained in the system, and I think it's unique part of those continuous programs that we have where it's like, yeah, we can help you in real time, not only with the systems and the processes side of things, but with the people too. All right, Jody, let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about e-invoicing and how that has changed the game for auditing and some of the things that we're seeing from our clients. So, both you and I were old enough to remember when things arrived in the mail, right? We had to scan them and put them into a system, and then, it kind of went from there. Tell me a little bit about how e-invoicing has changed the accounts payable function in the last, say, 5 years.
As you alluded to, 15 years ago, invoices would arrive at a company through the mail, and they would be manually entered into the client's system by AP analyst or clerk, but someone would have to sit there and hard key into the system some of the basic information about that invoice, such as the invoice number and the amount. And then we saw that slowly shift to invoices that were in a digital format. So we had vendors emailing invoices into organizations, and a lot of companies set up centralized inboxes to receive invoices. And then those would be put into a queue to be processed by accounts payable. Now we're seeing more of that shift to what I call e-invoicing, which is where companies have adopted web-based portals where vendors will go into these portals and actually input the invoice into the system themselves. So no longer do we have accounts payable analysts entering the basic details about the invoices, such as the amount and the invoice number and the invoice date. That's all being done by the vendor now. And after that input is done by the vendor, that invoice is then put into the workflow. It goes through an approval process and ultimately gets paid. And most of the involvement of accounts payable departments are dealing with the exceptions that come out of that process, things, invoices that for whatever reason do not flow smoothly through the system. So it's definitely changed the profile of errors that we find whenever we do audits now, because it's no longer where the input process is starting within the company being done by its employees. The input process is starting at the vendor's office by their employees. And so it kind of shifts where the errors are occurring and who's responsible for them and the types of issues that you see today versus what we would see, 10, 15 years ago.
Like, I'm thinking about that just in terms of like, the potential for errors too, right? Like in the past, it used to start with the supplier generating the invoice. It could be errors at that stage. And so what you're telling us now is that there's fewer opportunities for human error in that whole e-invoicing process. Do I have that right?
No, actually, I would say there's more opportunity. Part of the errors that we see today are driven by the normal invoicing process where some adjustment is needed after the fact. And that invoice has to be updated. Maybe the pricing was wrong. Maybe the purchase order that was referenced was wrong, but there's an update process that needs to occur. That sometimes can present a challenge to vendors and the ultimate approver of those invoices to coordinate on what happens with the original invoice that was submitted and ensuring that that one is obsoleted in the system
Mm.
and that the new one can be the only one that's processed. Some of the errors, though, are attributed to, I would say, almost a lack of training that's provided to vendors whenever these new systems are adopted. Ultimately, their goal is, when it comes to invoicing, is to get paid for that invoice.
Mm.
Um, and if there are instances where an invoice is past its payment terms, the vendor needs to know the correct channels to go through in order to find out what is causing the delay.
Mhm.
And if the vendor hasn't been trained on the appropriate resources to use in those cases, and they're not giving adequate support, so in other words, they're trying to contact someone at the company and they can't get a response, then the natural behavior, I believe, is to load that invoice again
Mhm.
and put it back in the system.
Mhm.
And that's definitely something that opens the door for errors to occur.
Interesting that there's that training gap, right, on the supplier side. Like, I can think back to, the job I had at ConocoPhillips where, we would often get those calls from suppliers where it's like, "Hey, I need to get paid," right? We were past due our payment terms, and interesting to me that that would drive some of the error behavior that you observe when you're going through these projects. So as a basic blocking and tackling item that companies need to address, it's, you know, um natural churn of people in and out of companies can drive a lot of the error process. And if you don't have good training and supports in place for those new people coming in on the supplier side, you're going to be error prone.
And I definitely think that the e-invoicing systems are great. They offer a lot of efficiency gains. They make the invoicing process from generation to payment a lot more visible for
Mm.
all the parties involved.
Mhm.
But it is a change, and you are putting more of the processing burden
Mhm.
on the vendors.
Mhm.
They're the ones now having to take care of the burden, the time investment of getting the invoices in the system.
Mhm.
Um, and in doing the audits that we've done of clients that utilize these portals, it's not uncommon for me to hear a lot of frustration from the vendor community about some of the challenges that they have in getting these systems to work and getting the invoices to be in the system where they can be approved and paid. Because, like I said, at the end of the day, the vendor just wants to be paid.
Mhm.
If the company is putting the burden on the vendors to handle more of the process for getting an invoice paid, they have to provide those vendors with as much training and support as possible.
Yeah.
They cannot turn these systems on and just think the vendors are going to figure it out and everything's going to work seamlessly. And I think the other thing to consider as well is there are a lot of different e-invoicing portals on the market.
Mm.
A company is going to pick one portal, but your vendor is having to deal with multiple companies that have all picked different portals.
Mm.
So they're having to learn 4 to 5 different systems that all have their unique challenges. They're all, you know, the steps for processing an invoice in those systems differ.
Mhm.
So,
And you're talking about like Open Invoice and Power Advocate and stuff like that.
yeah,
Okay.
Open
Okay.
Invoice,
Yeah.
Ariba,
Yeah.
um, all these systems function a little bit differently, and your vendor is having to learn multiple systems in order to service all of their customer base. So I think that's important for companies to keep in mind as well,
Yeah.
as that it's advantageous to them to provide the training and support that
Yeah.
their vendors need in order to make this beneficial for all parties.
It's really cool. You talk a lot about like how the results that we deliver are really tangible, but the more that we talk about this, I'm like, the real benefit for the companies is, yeah, for sure the money is important, right? Cash is always a really important part of every company, but the learning opportunity, like where they can really dive in under the cover and know where their business weaknesses are.
Mhm.
I think we can really help them there too. So it sounds very cool. One of the things that, I'm sure you've heard from many of clients and people who are considering revenue is like, hey, look, I've already got 4-way or 10-way matching on my invoices. So let's build a little bit on that answer you just gave and let's explore a little bit about how that software or that functionality has changed the audit industry. Where do you see the errors shifting from, and where do you see them shifting to?
I first started in this industry 20 plus years ago. It was not uncommon to do an audit and have 50% or more of the errors come from duplicate payments.
Mm.
Situations where accounts payable groups were getting multiple copies of the same invoice and processing those twice into the system.
Mm.
With this shift into e-invoicing, there no longer is the situation where accounts payable is doing the entry. The entry is being done by the vendor. So we see situations where vendors are billing the same charges on two different invoices that have unique numbers. We're seeing issues where vendors are not submitting credit memos
Mm.
into these e-invoicing platforms. And that may be, in some cases, intentional. In other cases, it may just be due to frustration. These e-invoicing systems are very dependent on purchase orders. Most of these systems only accept invoices to be entered that are billed against a existing purchase order that is open to be billed against. And when it comes to credits, especially let's say, for example, credits for return material, vendors may not always be able to identify where the purchase of that material originally occurred. For example, they may be asked by a client to come out to a yard that's used for storing material that a utility may need to use to service its area. So it may just have a surplus of transformers,
Power
cables,
poles.
power
Yeah. So
poles.
lay down yard for that stuff. And
And over time, material may have accumulated.
yeah.
And one day someone decides we don't need this. Let's send it back to the vendor.
Yeah.
And so the vendor comes and picks that material up. That material could have been sitting out there for years.
Mm.
And it could have been purchased over a number of different purchase orders,
Yeah.
but due to the elapse of time, there's no way to identify where that material was originally paid from.
Yeah. So you literally have all this material to return. Let's just say the PO's been closed for over a year and a half, and the e-invoicing system will not allow the vendor to create an entry that says, hey, I've actually got a credit memo here for you. So that credit ends up being stranded in no man's land. And so a lot of our work is around that part of just like business improvement for the customers, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's best practice with these e-invoicing portals that, yes, they are designed to work around purchase orders and have invoices submitted against existing purchase orders. It just that increases the efficiency of the overall
Yeah.
processing of the invoice.
Yeah.
But there are going to be situations where that's just not possible.
Yeah.
And you either have to be very clear with vendors what the alternative process is to use
Mhm.
whenever they're not able to identify a purchase order and they
Mhm.
have a credit memo, or give them an alternative means of submission. So maybe you configure the e-invoicing portal to have a separate area where vendors can load non-PO credit memos,
Yeah.
but you have to give them the alternative.
Yeah.
Because if in the absence of no alternative, then that credit memo will just remain open on the account
Yeah.
for a number of years or ultimately be written off.
Experience has always shown me that you have to make the tool easy to use if you want people to use it, right? And that includes on the vendor side, right? So if you're making it difficult for them to transact with you, then they're going to be like water running downhill. They'll always follow the path of least resistance. And so it's again another great example of, yeah, it's nice that the cash benefits there when we do these projects, but really at the end of the day, it's about identifying gaps in sort of what I would call operational procedures on the accounts payable side too, right?
Yeah. And you hit on something earlier on in your question about companies that have purchase order, pretty mature purchase order processes in place, and they have three-way or four-way match controls.
Mm,
And I have encountered a lot of companies that get a false sense of security from those processes. And what has happened in almost every single case is at the end of doing our project, when we take the errors that we have identified and break those down by were these errors that occurred on PO based invoices or were the errors that occurred on non PO based invoices, the majority of errors in the largest by a large margin are invoices that are based on POs. And that's surprising to a lot of companies that how does that happen? What we have seen a lot in our experience is there are certain situations where POs are very easy to create.
mm,
When you're buying material, you're able to specify, I'm buying 5 units of this material and it's going to cost X. Those situations are very easy to document upfront in a PO,
mhm.
and the resulting invoice should exactly match those same details. But a lot of the purchasing that our clients do is labor, and it's much more difficult to create a very distinct PO around labor. It's not a situation where you can say, I'm going to buy X number of hours of labor,
Mhm.
and this is going to be the breakdown of individuals that's going to work on this project, and this is going to be the ultimate cost. In most cases, what's done is what we call a blanket purchase order, where we set up a purchase order for some budgeted amount,
Mm.
let's say $1 million, and that is intended to incur all the labor that is done on a certain site for a certain period of time. So let's say 6 months or a year.
Yep.
So in those situations, it is very easy for two invoices that are billing for the exact same work to both be approved and processed against that invoice without any sort of alert in the ERP
That would never come
system
up.
being
Yeah.
triggered.
Yeah, it would never come up.
Yeah, really, at the end of the day, your only control against that is the individuals that are looking at those invoices and
Yeah.
approving them for payment. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, in today's world where resources are very constrained and people are tasked with doing a lot of different things,
Yeah.
sometimes that invoice review process is one of the processes that suffers.
Got a personal experience, and I remember a really interesting story about that exact thing, Jody, where it's like, everything if you go back to from the blanket purchase order. So this was on an industrial site, and it was for, large contingent workforce that was fulfilling, waste management on the large industrial site, right? And if you were only looking at it from the procure to pay cycle, was it followed properly? Yes. Okay. Are the systems aligned between us and the vendor? Yes, everything's good. Proper training in place? Yes, 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 yes. And yet there was still a ton of duplicates that was happening. The company could not figure out why the blanket PO was getting, it should have lasted 6 months based on the labor requirement, and it was lasting in between 4.5 and 5 months, right? So huge cost overruns. Like we're talking millions of dollars. You want to know what the root cause was?
Probably duplicate billings.
It was duplicate billings, and the root cause of why the duplicate billings were not being caught was exactly what you were talking about. It was at the approver level, right? And quite frankly, it was a superintendent, so full budget authority to basically be doing this, but they'd get to the end of their 12-hour shifts. So they're probably running on fumes already, probably at 13th or 14th hour of their 12-hour shift, and they look at their queue of approvals in SAP. What do you think they do?
Go through it very quickly.
Just hit the button as fast as they can, right? And so that was the root cause that that particular company found, and that would never have been caught by, just a standard review. It was only through a deeper dive review, like what you're describing, that was discovered, and the mitigations were put in place, which is like, hey, we just need to push some of these approvals a little bit further down, so that there are more opportunity for people who are closer to the work to be reviewing them and approving them, right? So yeah, that would have never been discovered without full AP review like you're talking about.
Thanks for spending time with us on Revving with Revenew. If you'd like to continue the conversation or explore how this applies inside your organization, connect with us on LinkedIn or visit revenew.com. Thank you so much for joining us.